Hello, everyone. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, host of Beat the Big Guys podcast. Welcome, everyone. And I'm so excited about my guest that I have with us today. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Darryl Malek-Wiley has been involved in environmental justice fights since he joined the Sierra Club in 1972. So a really, really long time. He was involved in the 1984-85 campaign to stop a permit by Freeport-McMoRan that was going to discharge hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive wastewater into the Mississippi River, which would have been New Orleans's drinking water. And we'll be talking about that a good bit more later on today. Darryl helped community groups in St. John the Baptist Parish to stop the construction of a large Formosa Plastics rayon plant in the 1990s and is currently helping communities in St. James Parish to stop Formosa Plastics again from building the world's largest plastic plant, which will make more, you guessed it, single-use plastic, of course. He is also currently working with a community group in St. John the Baptist Parish to reduce toxic emissions from a DuPont Denka petrochemical plant, which has made the community at the highest cancer risk in the United States. Welcome, Darryl. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, glad to be with you today, Sandy.
You know, I don't know if you know this, but I moved here in the summer of 1980. And I remember when my feet hit the ground, this was right after graduate school, the name Jim Bob Moffett was everywhere. He was bigger than life. Freeport McMoRan, Jim Bob Moffett, and it was always in the most glowing terms. When I say bigger than life, I absolutely mean that. I understand that this was right around the time in 1980 when I moved here that Moffett had put together one of the largest corporate mergers in Wall Street history, combining his company, McMoRan Oil and Gas, with Freeport Minerals to form Freeport McMoRan. So we're talking about, will you talk about the big guys? Freeport McMoRan and Jim Bob Moffett were definitely an example of that. So let's jump right in, Darryl. Tell us about your battle with Freeport McMoRan.
Right. So I've got a bad habit. I read the classified ads, especially the notices that are in the micro print. And I was reading one in the late 1984, and it said Freeport McMoRan and two other phosphofertilizer plants wanted to have a new permit to discharge in the Mississippi River. So I started reading about it and researching it, and I became an expert on phosphogypsum, not what I wanted to become an expert on. But phosphogypsum is made when they take phosphorus rock from Florida, where they strip mine it, they ship it to Louisiana, they react it with chemicals to make PO5, phosphorus and 5 oxygens. It's super rich fertilizer. That's what they put on the fields for farmers and things like that. But for every ton of fertilizer, you get 5 tons of gypsum waste. So every ton of product, 5 tons of waste. And what are you going to do with the waste? Well, until the Clean Water Act came in 1972, they were dumping it on the Mississippi River because there were no laws, no regulations. So when the Clean Water Act came in 1972, they told them, no, you can't put this in the river. So permits under the Clean Water Act have to be renewed every 10 years. So in 82, they started asking EPA, well, now we've had 10 years experience. We think we know what's going on. We've got all these studies, and we don't think it's going to harm the river. And so that's how it got set up. And so I started researching their studies. The first thing that alarmed me was that EPA was going to have one public hearing about the permit, and it was going to be in Baton Rouge. And Baton Rouge doesn't get its drinking water out of the Mississippi River. We do in New Orleans, So we
In
had a
Baton
fight.
Rouge, I understand in Baton Rouge, there's an all aquifer.
Right. All aquifer drinking water in Baton Rouge. So right off the bat, we had a fight with EPA to get them to have hearings in New Orleans, which, because the plant proposed discharge would impact our drinking water. And so in researching and reading their documents, I came across a few different things. One, it said negative impact on aquatic life in the mixing zone, which is mixing zones where you put the pollution in the river and it mixes up. And so you had to follow, it had a footnote, and you had to follow that into a different volume. And there they said at 98% Mississippi River water and only 2% of this pollution, 100% of the fish died.
And
that's a real negative impact on aquatic life.
That's a big, and it was a completely different, you said a separate volume. I mean,
separate volume, yeah.
A separate set of documents.
Yeah, because they put together all these kind of research studies about, what was going on, and they stacked up about 5 feet. So I read 5 feet worth of documents. And so the negative impact on aquatic life really shocked me. And then also gypsum waste. We don't think about it, but usually gypsum, we think about sheetrock, what's in our houses, what, our walls are made out of. The problem is when they mine the phosphorus rock in Florida, the naturally occurring rayon and other radioactive materials stick to the gypsum waste. So the waste they wanted to dump into the river was slightly radioactive. Okay, so
a little bit is a lot to me.
Yeah, most people say you should have no exposure to radioactivity because of impacts it will have on your body in different ways. So I took their data and gave it to some friends of mine who are medical doctors here in New Orleans. And they sort of played with the data, and they came up with the conclusion. Their conclusion was that the amount of radioactivity that Freeport-McMoRan was proposing to put in the Mississippi River would have increased the leukemia risk for a person in New Orleans by 2%. That's pretty significant.
Yes.
And
50 miles away.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and it would not only, every parish between where the plant was at and the end of the Mississippi River get their drinking water out of the Mississippi River. So it would have impacted a million plus people that get their drinking water out of the Mississippi River. So we had to go through this whole process of getting the hearing in New Orleans, which we successfully did.
And about what year? Excuse me, Darryl.
That was
what
1984.
Thank you.
So we had a public hearing in Baton Rouge. They had 2 public hearings in Baton Rouge and then 1 in New Orleans. And because we had been working on raising concerns, doing research, Acorn, the community group Acorn, really did a lot of research and organizing also. And we had a banner, no radioactive water in our drinking water. It's pretty
no-brainer.
A no-brainer, so.
But you brought it to the community of people that would care.
Right. We got it out. We talked to lots of different folks. I made, put together significant comments. And it got very publicized in the media. Because we started raising questions, the newspaper reporters started digging into it. The television stations started digging into it. And so it became more of a public awareness of this problem. Now, we had some really good allies. One of them was a woman by the name of Maureen O'Neill, and she worked for the New Orleans Sewage and Water Board. And the Sewage and Water Board was concerned because if you're putting this stuff into the drinking water, they would be responsible for taking it out, which then cost them a bunch of money. So, and Maureen O'Neill was I think her job was to sort of make sure that anything that was happening politically that would impact the Sewage and Water Board, she helped organize people to try and stop it. So she was very active in making sure we got resolutions from the Sewage and Water Board that they didn't like it. The city of New Orleans put out a resolution saying they were opposed to permit. And not only that, because it became so politicized, every parish downstream of St. James passed an ordinance saying they were opposed to the permit. That has never happened before. It's never happened since. That all the political figures were saying this is a bad idea. And at the time, Jim Bob Moffitt, as you said, he's a well-known, donated to lots of causes. The Freeport Mac-Ran made donations to the symphony, to the opera, to, UNO, Tulane. And Jim Bob Moffitt, though, he was a public relations person's nightmare, because when he went on camera or went before a microphone, he, from my point, made my case. He said all sorts of things like, well, if you don't want our plant, we'll leave. And by the time he said that, most folks were saying, well, don't let the screen door hit your ass on the way out. And he would make outrageous statements that we would then come back with reasonable statements about the impact of the radioactivity. We would talk about, how it impacts individuals. We talked about the impact on aquatic life. So it got so politicized that, at the public hearing in New Orleans, as a teacher brought in her third grade class at the public hearing, and when they made comments, they had a song. Please, Mr. Jim Bob, don't poison our river.
Can you sing it for us?
No, I can't. My singing voice is, no, you don't want to hear that. But the kids, did this, and every television station in New Orleans had a camera there, and they recorded it.
Brilliant.
And it was, because the Sierra Club had zero budget. We were working on donations, and, Freeport Mac-Ran is a multinational corporation that had a PR staff, and, they were doing, so it was just definitely David and Goliath. And so we were able to politicize it so that EPA said they would hold off on the permit because the governor of Louisiana, I think it was Edwards at that time, set up a blue ribbon panel on what we want to do with the gypsum waste. And so I was appointed to the panel. Oliver Houck, environmental lawyer at Tulane Law School, was appointed to the panel. And, political leaders in St. James, St. John, Department of Environmental Quality. I think there were 13 or 14 people appointed to the commission, the Blue Ribbon Panel. And the first meeting we had, I looked around the room, and, I was at that time 34. So I was the youngest one in the meeting. Everybody was much older. Everyone was white.
Did you have a long white beard when you
I
were
didn't have a
34?
long white, it was brown at that time. I was the only one with facial hair at that time. Um, and I said, right then I said, how can we have all these white people in here making this discussion that's going to impact the city of New Orleans, which is more majority African American? So I pushed for getting an additional person on the panel, which was an African American leader in New Orleans East. And so even at that time, I've been involved in environmental justice issues since before there was the term environmental justice. So we had a number of meetings. I mean, it started in 1984. It went into 1985. We had these meetings every 2 weeks talking about, how we could do different things. Freeport, McMoran, and the other two companies, Becker Fertilizer and Agrigo Fertilizer, they hired all sorts of scientists to do studies about why it was good, why it was useful,
Why radioactivity is good for you.
yeah, why radioactive, why it's okay to put it in the Mississippi River. And it ended, the whole process ended because the legal hook, and so many times with environmental fights, you have to find something that you can legally challenge a permit. And Oliver Howe came up with the idea, and that what it would do, it would completely change the nitrogen phosphorus ratio of the Mississippi River. And the EPA had regulations in place that said you can't do that. You can't change the whole chemistry of a river or lake. That's not allowed. It's not allowed to do that. So it stopped EPA from issuing the permit. And so what happened was all these companies had to stop discharging it in the Mississippi River. And now they have stacked it into gigantic mountains of slightly radioactive gypsum waste at their plant sites. And if you go on Google Earth, you can see the site in one site in St. James and one in St. Parish. They're gigantic. The one in St. James Parish is about a mile long by a half mile and 200 feet tall.
And wasn't it one of these things that was getting ready to burst recently in
Right.
Florida and it caused
Yeah,
had to evacuate?
Right. Yeah, the one in St. James, the Uncle Sam plant, which is now owned by Mosaic Chemical, because Freeport McMoran got out of the fertilizer business.
Interesting.
But the wall on the north side of this gigantic stack shifted because of the weight and because the ground underneath couldn't handle the weight. And
so in
the
Florida,
only way they found,
we
yeah,
had
in
this,
Florida, they had a number of,
in case our listeners aren't aware, Florida had a near catastrophe when one of these gypsum mountains, for lack of a better word, nearly broke and would have released all of this toxic solutions. And meanwhile, here in Louisiana, we have at least 3 of these. Right here.
Yeah,
nearby.
and the one in Florida, the Piney Point site, this last year and into this year, released all sorts of water into Tampa Bay, and it has caused serious red tides in Tampa Bay. They've already buried over 180,000 tons of dead fish into landfills because of all the fish that died from the red tide. So it's a pretty massive disaster. I'm working with a group of folks that are focused on the phosphogypsum fertilizer industry. here in Louisiana and in Florida. There's also one that's been closed in Mississippi that leaked and killed all sorts of fish in the Mississippi Sound. There's also one in two in Idaho, one in North Carolina, a number in Illinois, and but the biggest ones are in Florida and Louisiana.
So without getting a little too distracted, we were wrapping
Right.
up with, you've got your blue ribbon panel. You've been
Right.
reading for months. The opposition had been trying to come up with studies saying it's fine to pump all the stuff into
Right.
and then Ollie Hauk, a professor of law at Tulane University, came up with the idea of recategorizing this waste.
Yeah, because of the waste is very, it's got a lot of phosphorus in it because that's what they, want for the fertilizer. The Mississippi River has a certain balance of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Gotcha.
And this would have flipped that balance and done all sorts of bad things to the Mississippi River ecosystem.
And that was you called it the hook.
The hook, yeah, you have to have
a permit.
Stop the permit.
And that was your success story. And this was happening
right.
mid 1985.
Right.
Well, so there's so many points that you touched on. I don't know where to begin. There are a lot of things, it was a little group. It started out with a little group, but not a lot of money. And I remember when I arrived here, I remember Stuart Phillips and at that time, his wife,
Joan Phillips.
Joan Phillips. And it was a small little group, but you stood up to the biggest of the big guys and won. And so this is a very important story for our listeners, because I know all of you out there see problems in your community, understand the problem, but feel like there's nothing you can do. So one of the first things that, Darryl, that you touched on was that you were a geek. That's okay. You read the material. You knew your material. And that is something that's really crucial if you want to beat the big guys. You got to know your stuff.
Yep.
And all it takes is reading. I remember, a lot of our listeners know I stood up to the Army Corps of Engineers 16 years ago when their levees broke. And a member of the Corps once asked me how I knew all these details about the levees. And I turned to him and smiled and said, I can read. That's the magic.
Yeah, that's the magic.
That's all it is. And I want to add to that is when you win, it wasn't who you knew, it was what you knew.
Yes. Yes.
And so don't ever let the people get bigger than life. And so do you want to add to that before we move on? Because you mentioned so many.
No, that's exactly true. Once you get involved in any type of environmental issue, the first thing you do is educate yourself and read and talk to other folks. And by the time you get really into the issue, you know more about the issue than the folks proposing it. So yeah, self-education's key.
And not hard.
No, not hard.
If you know how to read. Okay, and then geeks rule the world, I like to say. And then another thing you did that was key was you made the issue relevant to as many people as you could. And it's not that difficult. Making something relevant to a wider group of people. In your case, it was having the meetings take place in New Orleans. Did you have a lot of pushback on that when you tried to move the committee meetings?
Yeah, it was a real effort, and I had to bring in Sierra Club leaders from around the country to put pressure on EPA to have a hearing in New Orleans.
But it worked.
It worked.
And so that is really critical, and it's not, and each example is a little different, but you want to get as wide of a community as possible. I can give you another example going on today. Darryl, have you heard about the push right now to convert some public space at Audubon Park into property that will be used by Tulane University?
No, I hadn't heard about that one
Okay,
yet.
well, you will, because it's right there in your neighborhood, and it's
Yeah,
only been going on for a couple of months now. But the issue, instead of making the issue be about tennis, what the leaders of this movement are trying to do is make the issue about public space. Because even if you
right,
don't
right,
like to go picnicking at City Park, you believe in the right to go picnicking at City Park.
right,
So
right,
that's another thing you did that I thought was really, really important and valuable for our listeners. Um, so another thing that stood out is you just you followed what I like to call it a formula. It says if you're trying to sell your idea to as many people as possible, it's not much harder than making a valid point, asking a reasonable question, backed up by the data. Those three things: make a valid point, ask a reasonable question, and back it up by the data. And then you're going to get the media on it.
yep,
And I, I,
yep.
I remember you said the media were all over it. It was that formula. I don't know if you realized you were using a formula at the time. Maybe if you fell into it, it seemed to be the logical thing to do. But it caught the attention of the media, and I'm not surprised. And also those children singing, I can't get that out of my head. That was brilliant, and that was again making it be about the community.
Right. Yeah, and it wasn't planned by me. It was just sort of the teacher and the students had been following it in the newspaper and decided they wanted to go do that. So
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
serendipity is wonderful.
It is. And then finally, I mean, we could go all day, but another thing that you mentioned yourself, and I wanted to shine the light on that, is you mentioned you had allies, and you need allies. No one can do anything alone,
No.
and allies is key. And you found allies in the group Acorn,
Yes.
and among others. There are others that you mentioned as well, and get them on board, and then your group starts, then your community group starts expanding exponentially. So, but the important thing is that the big guys are never so big that you can't beat them. And the big guys, sometimes having all the money in the world is a bad thing. They make really dumb mistakes.
Yep.
I didn't realize that Mr. Moffat, Mr. Jim Bob, uh, was shot himself in the foot when he got in front of a camera. I didn't
Oh,
know about that.
yeah, lots of times,
And
which, was great. You always want to have your opponent be bad on the media, because we're trying to be reasonable. That's all, all we want is water that doesn't have radioactivity in it. That's very reasonable. So, and we were able to also say the main person that wins is Jim Bob Moffat saves money. And he's a multimillionaire. Why should we let him save money?
Well, we should probably take this moment to point out that Mr. Jim Bob did recently pass away. Uh,
Yes.
Bigger than life, and loved by a lot of people, especially in Texas, where he eventually moved. He didn't stay here in New Orleans. So, but Jim Bob Moffat, you were bigger than life, most certainly, most
That's
certainly.
yes.
Darryl, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered it pretty much. And it's the important thing is not being afraid.
Mm.
Not being, if you see something wrong, there are other people that probably see the same thing wrong, and you just need to start talking to people and building things. And uh, General Honore, says if you see something, smell something, hear something, speak out, and that's what you need to do.
Well, I completely agree. I think those are great words to leave for our listeners. Just don't be afraid, and because you're not alone. You are not
Yes.
alone. Okay. Well, Thank you so much, Darryl Malek-Wiley, for joining me. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Well, thank you, Darryl. I'm going to go ahead and
Thank
stop recording.